You think you can touch this? Get away from my board. I've got this.
He fixed it.
Impossible.
Get your filthy hands off that terminal, you illiterate mute, before I have security drag you out of this building in handcuffs. Trent Sterling's voice echoed through the cavernous, glass-walled server floor of Aegis Financial Systems, slicing through the chaotic hum of failing hardware and the frantic cries of panicked engineers. He stood in the center of the room, his face flushed a mottled, furious red, his $15,000 Rolex Daytona catching the harsh fluorescent light as he jabbed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger at the man in the faded blue utility uniform. Marcus did not flinch. He did not step back. He did not lower his eyes. Standing before the primary master control console, a machine that governed the algorithmic flow of $100 billion in daily global trade routing, Marcus simply looked at Trent, his dark, cracked hands, rough from years of harsh chemical exposure and physical labor, hovered mere inches above the mechanical keyboard. He wore a heavy, industrial-grade yellow rain jacket over his standard-issue janitorial shirt. His second-hand steel-toed boots grounded firmly on the raised anti-static flooring. The silence radiating from Marcus was absolute. It was a physical force in the room. He could not speak. A severe bout of nerve damage years prior had paralyzed his vocal cords completely, but his stillness spoke volumes. It was a cold, impenetrable armor. He did not react emotionally. He did not beg for understanding. He simply stared at Trent with a look of profound, clinical observation, the way a scientist might look at a specimen thrashing in a petri dish. "I said back away!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria as the overhead monitors flashed a blinding, apocalyptic crimson. "You are a cleaner! You empty the trash! You have no idea what you are looking at, and you are contaminating a level 1 clearance zone." Around them, 24 senior engineers, data scientists, and systems architects stood frozen. Not one of them intervened. A junior developer in the corner pulled out an iPhone and began recording, snickering nervously behind his hand. The VP of Logistics, a man who had ignored Marcus in the hallways for 3 years, simply crossed his arms and looked away. Complicit in his silence, they thought they were watching the final, pathetic humiliation of a broken, impoverished man who had wandered out of his depth. They thought they were witnessing the rightful enforcement of their exclusive, white-coated corporate hierarchy. But before we get to the absolute collapse of Trent Sterling's world and the reckoning that would permanently alter the landscape of global financial technology, you need to understand exactly who was standing at that keyboard. The smell of ammonia and industrial lemon cleaner always settled deep into the fabric of Marcus's clothes by the end of his shift. It was a sharp, biting scent, one that lingered on his skin long after he had scrubbed his hands with heavy pumice soap. For 5 years, this had been his daily reality. Every evening at exactly 6 p.m., as the high-powered executives and brilliant coders of Aegis Financial Systems packed their leather briefcases and descended into the subterranean parking garage to their imported luxury sedans, Marcus would arrive. He would push his heavy, squeaking utility cart out of the service elevator on the 42nd floor. The contrast was always jarring. The Aegis headquarters was a cathedral of modern wealth, perched high above the glittering skyline. The floors were imported Italian marble, the walls lined with acoustic wood paneling that absorbed the ambient noise of billion-dollar decisions. The lighting was always perfectly calibrated, casting a soft, golden afternoon glow that made everything look like a cinematic masterpiece. Against this backdrop of immense, untouchable privilege, Marcus moved like a shadow. He was a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his late 50s, his hair graying at the temples. His uniform was worn thin at the elbows, the name tag slightly crooked, His hands, deep brown and permanently calloused, bore the tiny, pale scars of chemical burns and a lifetime of manual labor. He moved with a deliberate, rhythmic precision, emptying the brushed steel recycling bins, wiping down the ergonomic standing desks, and vacuuming the thick, plush carpets of the executive suites. He never spoke. The mutism was a permanent condition, the result of a severe viral infection in his 30s that had destroyed the recurrent laryngeal nerve. When he needed to communicate with his supervisor, he used a small, battered notebook he kept in his breast pocket, writing in sharp, immaculate block letters. To the people who worked at Aegis, he was practically invisible. He was a piece of the infrastructure, no more human to them than the thermostats or the automatic soap dispensers in the lavish restrooms. But Marcus's silence was not born of subservience. It was born of an internal code, a deep reservoir of dignity that no amount of condescension could drain. His mother, Eleanor, had been a domestic worker in the wealthiest neighborhoods of a deeply segregated southern city. She had spent her life washing the floors of people who refused to look her in the eye, but every evening, when she returned to their small, drafty apartment in a red-line district, smelling of cocoa butter and exhaustion, she would sit with young Marcus at the kitchen table. The scent of garlic and baking bread would fill the cramped space, fighting back the damp smell of the building. She had bought him a second-hand Commodore 64 computer from a pawn shop, sacrificing months of grocery money to give him a window into a different world. She would watch him write his first clumsy lines of basic code, her cracked, swollen hands resting gently on his shoulders. "Silence isn't empty, Marcus," she had told him one evening, her voice rich and steady. "It's full of answers. The loud people are too busy to hear. Never let them dictate your volume, and never let them mistake your quiet for weakness." That single sentence became the thematic spine of his life. Marcus was not just a janitor. Before the illness took his voice, before the crushing medical debt forced him to liquidate his assets and fade into obscurity to protect his family's remaining estate, Marcus Vance had been a pioneer. He was one of the original architects of the high-frequency trading algorithms that built the modern financial sector. He had written the foundational logic, the deep assembly language bedrock that Aegis financial systems still use to process transactions. He was the ghost in the machine. He had sold the patent rights years ago to pay for his late wife's medical care, retaining only a quiet, ironclad clause in a forgotten legal document that granted him ultimate administrative oversight of the legacy code. A fail-safe he had insisted upon because he knew the system's volatile potential. When he took the night shift cleaning job at Aegis 5 years ago, it wasn't a punishment, it was a sanctuary. It was a way to earn a steady pension, secure premium health insurance for his ailing sister, and most importantly, it allowed him to keep a quiet, protective eye on the system he had built from scratch. His daily ritual grounded him. Every morning, after finishing his shift at 4 a.m., he would sit on the fire escape of his modest apartment, drinking dark, black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. He would watch the sun rise over the city, a heavy silver pendant belonging to his mother resting against his chest. He knew who he was. He did not need the validation of the men in the glass towers, but the men in the glass towers demanded absolute submission. Trent Sterling, the newly appointed director of infrastructure at Aegis, was the embodiment of everything Marcus despised. Trent was 32 years old, the beneficiary of generational wealth, legacy Ivy League admissions, and a profound lack of self-awareness. He wore custom-tailored Italian suits that smelled faintly of expensive bourbon and sandalwood. He treated the office like his personal fiefdom. For months, Trent's behavior toward Marcus had been a masterclass in escalating microaggressions. It started with subtle dismissals, stepping directly into Marcus's path and forcing the older man to move, leaving spilled coffee on his desk with a sticky note that read, "Clean this up before morning." Then, it escalated. Trent had a trigger, He possessed a deep, unexamined bias that could not tolerate the sight of a black man, especially a working-class black man in a worn uniform, occupying spaces he deemed exclusive. One evening, Marcus had been cleaning the glass walls of the primary server room. He had paused for a moment, his eyes scanning a scrolling string of code on a diagnostic monitor. He had noticed a slight memory leak in the routing protocol. Trent had walked by, stopped, and sneered. "What are you looking at, mop boy?" Trent had said loudly, ensuring the junior analyst nearby could hear. "Hoping to learn how to read. Stick to the toilet brushes. The math on that screen requires an IQ above room temperature." Marcus had not reacted. He had simply picked up a bucket, the ammonia smell sharp in his nose, and walked away. The bystanders had laughed, but Marcus had documented it. Every insult, every breach of protocol, every instance of Trent bypassing crucial security checks to rush software deployments. Marcus kept a meticulously encrypted drive at home, filled with time-stamped observations, system logs he memorized and recreated, and personnel violations. He was preparing for the day the system would break under Trent's arrogant mismanagement. He didn't have to wait long. It happened on a Tuesday at 11:14 p.m. Marcus was on the 42nd floor, pushing his cart down the fluorescent-lit corridor, the squeak of the wheels the only sound in the quiet hallway. Outside, a violent thunderstorm was lashing the city, heavy rain hammering against the reinforced glass windows. He was wearing his yellow rain jacket because the building's HVAC system was notoriously drafty on the upper levels. Suddenly, the ambient lighting in the hallway shifted from soft gold to a harsh, flashing emergency red. A klaxon alarm began to wail, a deep, synthetic, bone-rattling sound. Marcus dropped his mop. The handle clattered loudly against the Italian marble. He didn't hesitate. He broke into a sprint, his steel-toed boots thudding heavily against the floor, heading straight for the Level 1 Master Control server room. When he swiped his universal maintenance badge to unlock the heavy glass doors, the scene inside was pure, unadulterated chaos. The room was freezing, the massive air conditioning units pumping out icy air to keep the massive server racks from overheating. The smell of burning ozone and overheating silicon filled the air. 24 people were packed into the room. Trent Sterling was standing at the master console, flanked by frantic engineers. On the massive 80-inch monitors spanning the front wall, a terrifying cascade of hexadecimal error codes was scrolling in light speed. The Leviathan routing protocol was collapsing. Aegis Financial handled high-frequency trades for sovereign wealth funds, pension accounts, and national banks. A failure in the routing protocol meant trades were being misdirected, duplicated, or deleted. Every second the system was down, the company was hemorrhaging tens of millions of dollars. The projected exposure of a total system failure was over $100 billion. It was an extinction-level event for the company. "Reroute the packet flow through the backup servers in Frankfurt!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking. He was sweating through his silk shirt. "We can't!" a terrified senior engineer yelled back, his hands shaking over his keyboard. The core algorithmic loop is caught in a recursive deadlock. The legacy code is rejecting the new patch you forced through this morning. It's completely locked out. We don't have the master override syntax. Trent slammed his fist against the desk. "Find it! Override it! If this goes down, we all go to prison." Marcus stood at the back of the room. He looked at the scrolling code. He didn't just read it, he felt it. It was his language. He saw the exact point of failure. Trent's team had implemented a latency reduction patch that ignored the asynchronous timing variables Marcus had built into the foundational architecture 20 years ago. The system wasn't broken, it was defending itself against an unauthorized intrusion. Without making a sound, Marcus unzipped his yellow rain jacket. He left it draped over a chair. He walked forward, stepping past a group of panicked data scientists. He walked directly to the master console. He reached out and gently but firmly pushed the senior engineer's hands away from the keyboard. The room went dead silent. The only sounds were the wailing alarm and the hum of the dying servers. Trent turned around. When he saw Marcus standing at the console, his hands hovering over the keys, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged venom. This was the inciting incident. This was the moment Trent's fatal flaw overrode whatever shreds of rationality he had left. He saw a black janitor in a faded uniform touching the most sensitive piece of technology in the hemisphere, and his mind snapped. Get your filthy hands off that terminal, you illiterate mute, before I have security drag you out of this building in handcuffs, Trent roared. Marcus did not react. He remained perfectly calm. His body language was entirely relaxed, betraying no fear. Trent closed the distance, getting right in Marcus's face. The smell of stale bourbon on his breath mixed sickeningly with the ozone. Are you deaf as well as dumb? You belong in the basement. You are a cleaner. You scrub toilets. You don't belong in this room. You don't belong on this floor, and you sure as hell don't touch my machines. The bystanders watched in stunned silence. The junior developer in the corner had his phone out, the red recording light blinking. A VP of operations stared at her shoes. They were complicit. Every single one of them was witnessing a profound, racially charged dehumanization, and they did absolutely nothing. Trent pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking with rage. I'm calling the police. I'm having you arrested for corporate sabotage. You're going to rot in a cell, you arrogant piece of trash. Marcus slowly turned his head. He looked at Trent. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't text an apology. He didn't cower. He opened a custom text-to-speech application he had coded himself. He typed 3 words, his thumbs moving with lightning speed. He pressed a button, and a calm, synthesized, metallic voice played from the phone's speakers. Call the police. Trent's jaw dropped. You think this is a joke? He dialed building security. Get a tactical team to the level 1 server floor immediately. We have an intruder attempting to sabotage the main console. As Trent screamed into his phone, one person stepped forward from the crowd. Grace Anderson, the Chief Information Security Officer. She was a stern, brilliant woman in her 50s, wearing a sharp navy blazer. She had only been with the company for 6 months, hired to clean up Trent's lax security protocols. She looked at Marcus. She looked at his hands hovering over the keyboard. She looked at the specific, rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the plastic casing, a nervous habit he only exhibited when calculating complex variables. She looked at the monitors. The legacy code flashing on the screen bore a specific, hidden, signature block buried in the hex code. A signature block that matched the initials MV. Grace stepped between Trent and Marcus. Stand down, Trent, Grace said, her voice like cracking ice. Are you insane, Grace? Trent spat. He's touching the master console. I said stand down, Grace repeated, her hand resting near the security alarm on her belt. She turned to Marcus. She didn't look at his uniform. She looked him directly in the eyes. Do you know the syntax to break the deadlock? She asked quietly. Marcus nodded once. Then do it, she said. Trent lunged forward. I am the director of infrastructure. I order you to... Before Trent could finish the sentence, Marcus's hands dropped to the keyboard. He didn't type like a janitor. He typed like a concert pianist. His fingers flew across the keys in a blur of motion, inputting complex command line prompts at a speed that made the senior engineers gasp. He was writing pure, unadulterated assembly code from memory, bypassing the graphical interface entirely, diving straight into the machine's central nervous system. He typed for exactly 42 seconds. Then, he hit the Enter key. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The red lights continued to flash. The klaxon continued to wail. Trent let out a harsh, mocking laugh. You see? He's a moron. He just accelerated the crash. Security's going to... Suddenly, the klaxon cut out. The silence that rushed into the room was deafening. The harsh red emergency lights flickered, stabilized, and shifted back to a calm, soothing blue. On the 80-inch monitors, the terrifying cascade of error codes stopped instantly. The screen cleared, replaced by a steady, scrolling green line of text. The engineers stared at the screens in utter disbelief. He hadn't just fixed the crash. He had rewritten the routing algorithm in real time, optimizing the entire system to run faster than it had before Trent's disastrous patch. Trent's face drained of color. He looked from the screen to Marcus, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. How did you guess the master override syntax? That's impossible. He didn't guess it, a voice boomed from the back of the room. The crowd parted instantly. Arthur Vance, no relation to Marcus, simply a coincidence of naming, the billionaire CEO and founder of Aegis Financial Systems, strode into the room. He was a ruthless, terrifying figure, dressed in a tuxedo, having clearly rushed over from a gala. He was flanked by the head of building security and 2 armed guards. Arthur ignored Trent completely. He walked straight up to Marcus. To the absolute shock of everyone in the room, the billionaire CEO bowed his head slightly. "It's been a long time, Marcus," Arthur said quietly. Marcus gave a short, stiff nod. Arthur turned to face the room. The silence was heavy, thick with the sudden, crushing realization that the reality they believed in was an illusion. "For those of you who are confused," Arthur said, his voice dripping with dangerous authority, "allow me to introduce the man you have spent the last 3 years ignoring. This is Marcus Vance. He is not a janitor, though he chose to take that role. 20 years ago, Marcus engineered the proprietary algorithmic architecture that this entire company is built upon. He holds the original patent to Project Leviathan." A collective gasp echoed through the server room. The junior developer dropped his phone. It clattered against the anti-static floor. "Furthermore," Arthur continued, pulling a folded legal document from his tuxedo pocket, "per the terms of his buyout agreement, Marcus retained perpetual, absolute administrative oversight of the core system. He holds the ultimate security clearance in this building, higher than mine, and certainly higher than yours, Trent." Trent's knees literally buckled. He grabbed the edge of a desk to keep from collapsing. The blood rushed from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. That's impossible. He's a mute. He's a cleaner. He doesn't even speak English properly. Marcus pulled out his phone. He held it up. He hit play on a pre-typed message. The calm, robotic voice filled the room, carrying the devastating weight of absolute moral authority. "I am mute by circumstance. You are ignorant by choice." Marcus began to type again. The room waited in paralyzed silence. The sound of his fingers tapping the glass screen was like hammer strikes. He finished typing, connected the phone to the room's central PA system via Bluetooth, and hit play. The synthesized voice echoed from the speakers in the ceiling, cold and exact. "You walked into my architecture. You modified my code. You risked the financial stability of millions of people who relied on my work. And when you saw a black man in a space you believed belonged exclusively to you, the first thing you did was attempt to humiliate me. You called me illiterate. You called me a saboteur." Marcus paused the playback. He looked directly into Trent's terrified eyes. He hit play for the final sentence. "I didn't break your system. You broke yourself." Arthur Vance stepped forward. "Trent Sterling, your unauthorized deployment of an untested patch nearly cost this firm $100 billion in global routing errors. Your gross negligence is only surpassed by your abhorrent, documented bigotry." Arthur gestured to Grace Anderson. "Grace, you are promoted to Director of Infrastructure, effective immediately." Grace nodded. "Thank you, Arthur. My first act will be to terminate Trent Sterling's employment for cause: gross misconduct and violation of core security protocols." "Security," Arthur snapped. "Confiscate Mr. Sterling's badge, his company phone, and his laptop. Escort him off the premises immediately. If he resists, involve the police he was so eager to call." The 2 armed guards stepped forward, grabbing Trent by the arms. Trent didn't fight back. He was utterly broken. The facade of his superiority had been shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. As he was dragged out of the server room, passing the very people who had laughed with him earlier, not a single person met his eye. The friends he thought he had evaporated into the shadows of their own complicity. Marcus watched him go. He felt no triumph, only a quiet, heavy exhaustion. He turned back to the console. He ran one final diagnostic check, verifying the stability of the global markets. He logged out, securing the system with a new, unbreakable encryption key. Then he picked up his yellow rain jacket. He picked up his mop. "Marcus," Arthur said softly, "you don't have to clean anymore. The board will offer you a seat tomorrow, whatever you want." Marcus pulled out his notebook. He wrote a single sentence and handed it to Arthur. "I am exactly where I choose to be. Fix your hiring protocols." Without another word, Marcus Vance pushed his utility cart out of the server room, the squeak of the wheels fading down the hallway. The fallout from that night was seismic. Within 72 hours, Aegis Financial Systems launched a massive internal audit. Trent Sterling was not only fired, but the company filed a civil suit against him for corporate negligence, resulting in a staggering $14.2 million judgment that bankrupted him, forcing the liquidation of his trusts and assets. He was blacklisted from the tech industry entirely. The internal audit revealed a systemic culture of racial bias and toxic management under Trent's leadership. 5 senior engineers and 2 VPs who had stood by and watched Marcus be humiliated were terminated for violation of the company's code of conduct. I just instituted the Vance Protocol, a mandatory operational policy requiring rigorous blind algorithmic testing before any system deployment, completely removing the arbitrary authority of middle management. And Marcus? 6 months later, on a warm Sunday afternoon, Marcus sat on the wooden porch of a beautiful sprawling house he had purchased in cash in the quiet suburbs. The smell of jasmine and warm earth filled the air. He was no longer working the night shift. He had finally accepted an advisory role on the board, working entirely remotely on his own terms. He sat in a wicker chair, holding his infant granddaughter on his lap. He traced the lines of her small, perfect hands. He could not speak to her, but he didn't need to. He reached into his shirt and pulled out his mother's silver pendant, letting the baby grasp it. The cycle of dignity continued. He had built an empire in silence, and he would pass that strength to the next generation without having to utter a single word. A man built the foundation of a $100 billion empire, only to be treated like garbage by a system that looked at the color of his skin, his worn clothes, and his physical disability, and decided he was worthless. What made this story matter wasn't the twist. It wasn't the shocking reveal that the janitor was actually the genius architect. What matters is the deeply uncomfortable question it forces us to ask ourselves. If Marcus had just been a janitor, if he didn't hold the secret key to saving the company, would Trent's abuse have been acceptable? Look at the bystanders in that server room. The people who recorded the humiliation, the people who looked away. According to recent statistical data analyzing workplace environments in the tech sector, nearly 68% of Black professionals report experiencing or witnessing racial discrimination in corporate spaces, yet fewer than 20% of bystanders ever intervene. The silence of the crowd is the loudest weapon bigotry has. What would you have done? Would you have stepped forward like Grace Anderson? Or would you have stared at your shoes, hoping to protect your own paycheck while another human being was stripped of their dignity? If this story made you angry, if it made you think about the spaces you occupy and the people who invisibly maintain them, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Send it to a manager, a colleague, or a friend who needs a reminder about the true nature of power. Subscribe to this series as we continue to document real stories of systemic accountability and the relentless pursuit of justice.
Because true worth doesn't need a custom suit. It doesn't need a loud voice or a corner office. True worth just needs unwavering, quiet integrity. Remember that.